Welcome to Season 2, Episode 8 of the Shared Practices Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Lowe. Today we have the third installment of our series of episodes with Dr. Hunter Smith, and we're going into the actual valuation methods to come up with a range of values it would be worth buying a practice for. So the great part is that we get Hunter's opinion on some actually bad methods that people use to value practices that are pretty common and standard in the industry that really don't make any sense. So he tears apart some methods and uses others and shows us how you as a solo doc buying your own practice, kind of what the best method for you would be. So let's get into it. Okay, we have back with us today for the third time, Dr. Hunter Smith. Thank you so much for being willing to, it's been kind of a marathon of podcasting at this point. So thanks for coming back on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited about this one. We're going to get into some acquisition evaluations a little bit, I think, which is probably my favorite topic that we've discussed.
Well, and we've kind of led up to this, and we've gotten all the background and the documentation and laid the foundation, but we didn't actually dive into how to come up with that range of numbers that you are going to use as your trigger point of, yes, this is worth it for me, or no, this is not worth it for me. So do you want to start there, or is there something else we should dive into first?
No, there's a couple things in the pre-show we talked about that I think we need to kind of address before we get into that, just a little bit more groundwork. And the first is demographics that we wanted to talk about.
That's right. Okay.
And, I'm not the biggest demographic expert. Most of what I have learned and researched primarily came from Dr. Luna at Breakaway Practice. So I know you've had on Startup Wizard, and you have to be a demographic guru to kind of do the kind of startups that he has. But they're also important. Oh, go ahead. Well,
I was going to say, people typically say like, okay, demographics are the most important factor for a startup. For an acquisition, the health of the practice kind of supersedes the demographics. If your demographics aren't as favorable, but the practice is profitable and the practice is healthy, then that can kind of override less than ideal demographics. Would you agree with that on the whole?
I do. And it actually in the reverse way as well. Demographics can kind of carry a bad-ish practice or a practice that needs external growth. So it doesn't matter as much as it does in a startup for sure.
Okay.
But it's still in any dental practice, the patient availability is going to be a key evaluating factor. So yeah, it can have exactly what you just said. The patient base that you're buying kind of supersedes the demographics to an extent.
Okay.
As long as you can replicate that, but demographics can also carry a bad practice towards a more profitable return on your investment if they support kind of a startup type demographic.
Okay. Interesting. So if you think of a bad practice with awesome demographics as a startup, then it can make sense to go with that. Even though the numbers might not make sense on paper, if you evaluate the opportunity in that area and say, hey, I would do a startup in this area, even if I wasn't buying this practice, then you've kind of got almost like a ready-made startup. You just got to do the marketing that would normally be associated with that startup for your practice that you're buying.
And I would actually approach them. There's, Dr. Luna and Breakaway may disagree with that, and other people who've had a lot of success with startups may disagree with what I'm about to say. But I would almost prefer that kind of quasi startup or buying at charts basically in a space and doing a startup out of it. That pseudo, I've done one, that pseudo startup. I would actually prefer that over a scratch start where you have to implement everything. There's pluses and minuses, of course, to both, but that's absolutely a really strong strategy outside of just purchasing a ready-made practice.
Awesome. Well, already I'm learning stuff because I had not thought about either of those things, but that totally makes sense now. The number that everyone throws out when they're looking at demographics is always this dentist to population ratio. And I think a lot of people from what I think you're going to talk about from Breakaway and from what I've talked about with other guys who've gone to Breakaway, a lot of people put an excessive amount of stock in this dentist to population ratio as just a simple at face value. So if it's above 2001, you're good, or if it's below such and such, you're not so good. What are your thoughts on that number just as a simple ratio?
Yeah, it's absolutely a starting point, but it holds very little weight if you don't understand the rest of the demographic that goes around it.
Okay.
So that's basically like saying the collections of the practice is X amount and then trying to extrapolate what kind of practice it is based on that. The well's much deeper than that, the surface, and that's just an easy starting point. It's an easy thing to hold your hat on. I mean, don't get me wrong. If you got something stupid like 1 to 11,000 or something like that, then that's probably a good demographic no matter what. But that it's really just a very surface layer description of what a demographic is.
Okay. And let's, I haven't had anyone on about demographics yet. And I have a few friends that, do you know George Hariri? He's one of the Midwestern students that's follows your threads on Dental Town on the Ask Hunter thread and in that group.
I do, yeah.
So he's going to come on and talk about it because he's been doing a lot of this analysis. But for someone who doesn't even know how to calculate the dentist to population ratio, like in theory, that makes sense. It's like, oh, count up the number of dentists and count up the population and divide. But where would you get that data, and how would you even be sure that that data is accurate?
The old school, I guess, way of thinking about it, or the very unsophisticated way to do it is by zip code.
Okay.
A lot of demographic type people that are really versed in the area just hate that, and it is just that. It's very unsophisticated. It's very inexact. But if you were going to get for your city or whatever and search it by zip code, then you would count the number of dentists versus the number of people that are in that zip code, and that's your ratio.
And would you go like on Google Maps and search for dentists, or would you go to Delta and search for the number of in-network providers? Like, how do you, because you look at a practice, you don't even know how many dentists are in that practice. How do you actually pin down that number?
Yeah, exactly. It's so unsophisticated, and so, I almost don't want to talk about it because it's not the way that I would approach it. But the bare minimum that you would do is just a Google search of the area, and that's what's happened too much. And when you're evaluating practices for people or looking at startups, they can get a false sense of what they're getting. So the better way even to describe that ratio number is based on a drawing area, and that may cover multiple zip codes. It may cover half of one zip code. It may cover, hardly any of the zip code. But the important thing is it covers your drawing area of the patients that you're trying to get in a radius around your practice, or that practice or the startup location. So that's a better way even to get that very basic number.
Okay. And to think about this drawing area, it's almost like, I think someone gave the example of if you're in a small podunk town of 3,000 and you come and you're the only dentist there, that might feel like slam dunk demographics. And maybe it is. But if you are one of 30,000 and there's 10 dentists in a population of 30,000, but none of the other dentists are doing any marketing, or they don't have good online presence and they don't have any online reviews, and you kind of look at what your competition is and you say, you know what, if I came in here and did things right and marketed well and had a strong online presence and really built this the right way, my potential patient pool is maybe 30,000 rather than that 3,000 that you'd be stuck with if you were in the middle of nowhere with no one but 3,000. Is that fair to explain it that way?
Yeah, I think those are the kind of the next levels, though, of demographic. When I talk about drawing area, I basically just mean how far a patient will come to that practice. In your 3,000 town example, you could technically draw from a bigger area of that if it's rural enough and the patients don't have a choice.
They're used to driving in for anything, so that whole county is going to come in.
Exactly. So the drawing area is a little bit different than what you described, which is the next layer of demographic, which would be population density and the competition analysis, which would go back to, if you had 10 dentists, those 10 dentists are not all equal in terms of their how big of a competition they are to your patient base. Some of them may be specialists, some of them may not advertise, some of them may heavily advertise and be after the exact same kind of patients that you are. Plus, they have been in the area longer, so they have an advantage where they may represent 2 or 3 dentists, versus the guy who doesn't advertise at all may not even represent the whole dentist in your dentist to population ratio. So those are the next level demographics, which companies that do these demographic analysis for you will kind of dive into: the competition, the draw area, the density of the area you're drawing from, and then the median income. So,
okay. Well, so let's take a step back then, because I didn't realize we were going up a level. I would say, how would you know how to define your drawing area, based if you're in a dense metro? Do you draw 2 miles out versus semi-rural? You're drawing 20 miles out versus super rural. You're drawing 50 miles out. How do you even decide when you're analyzing practices and areas what to make that area?
Yeah, I don't think there's hard and fast rules there.
Okay.
But the way you kind of described it was correct. And where I am in Jonesboro or Northeast Arkansas, just in my little segment of the world, I have practices that draw from 20 miles. And then I have other practices that draw from 2 miles, 3 miles. So, we draw from bigger than that, but the majority of our patients are going to be in that 5-mile radius circle or whatever. So there's not hard and fast rules.
But you could almost think about it. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, even to the extent of a perfect circle around the area, if you're going away from a major metro, your circle may go 10 miles out that way, but not go at all in towards the major metro area because there's more competition there. So it's not a perfect circle around. The draw area is not exact circle around the practice necessarily. So there's not hard and fast rules there. It's just basically how far would someone drive to come see you.
I guess another way to think about it would be, how many dentists are they going to drive past to get to you? And
yeah, that's a good thought.
And in one direction, maybe there's none. And so you're the closest on that edge of the city. And in the other direction, there's 5, due west of you, 2 miles. So that might be a way, if you kind of just plot it out and visually make a judgment call, you might be able to kind of think about it that way. Exactly.
And, this is such a complex subject. It's one that can really make or break a practice. It absolutely will make or break a startup. It can on the acquisition side as well. So much so that I don't think any amount of, if I were doing it today, knowing everything that I know and all the practices that we've purchased and reviewed, I would absolutely have a professional demographic report made. I'd go to Breakaway and listen to Dr. Luna talk about demographics and what to look for, so that when I got the report, I understood it. But I would not go in that way, especially for a startup, willy-nilly and just try to do this research on my own. I would let a professional do it who's got way more data than you, who can really peg down these numbers more in a more sophisticated way.
So who's out there that does this for dentists, and who would you recommend?
The one that I've heard most, and the one that I would do myself, is Dentagraphics.
Dentagraphics. Okay.
Yeah. There's a couple on Dental Town as well that I don't feel super comfortable just naming because I've not used them personally.
You have used Dentagraphics though?
We have worked with people who have.
Okay,
so
sure.
They haven't done our exact practices, but I've seen the reports and I know that they do a nice job, and they come highly recommended enough that I would feel comfortable giving that. Actually, I haven't actually paid them $1 of Southern Dental Group money.
Well, and that's just fine too. I mean, the fact that you firsthand have seen what they put out and you've done, way more acquisitions than me or most dentists ever do in their lifetime. You've got a lot of stock there just to be able to evaluate and say, yeah, this is what I would do. This is the kind of analysis that I would want for my next acquisition, or if I were to recommend them to someone. So we'll have a link to that in the show notes. And maybe if I get around to it, we'll even try and link to some threads on Dental Town, people talking about dentographics. Are people on Dental Town saying good things about them?
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple of individual names on there as well. And just to explain a little bit, the reason I haven't done these for my practices, and I'm suggesting it, is because the type of practices that we buy and the number one type that I recommend is one where you're not heavily reliant on the demographics. So they're a contributing factor, but not the only factor. But if you're going to be in a major metro area, or you're in a highly competitive area, and you're trying to buy these practices that you do need external growth to succeed with,
right?
That's when I'm really recommending a professional demographic research.
Well, and there's another guy, and you don't have to comment either way, but Jamie Amos has a book. He has a podcast, but I've read his book, and it's got like these 12 or 15 steps for analyzing demographics. So if you know nothing about dental demographics, that would be a great place to just kind of give yourself a base foundation of knowledge. It would be to get his book and kind of get thinking about that. Because there's a lot, like you said, it's a complex subject. There's a lot that goes into it. And he's got a whole book. I think it's on Amazon. We'll have a link to that. I got the ebook or the Kindle version, and then I paid for the audiobook because I only do audiobooks these days. So it was worth it for me. I understood things better afterwards.
Yeah, it's just something. There's a lot of things in dentistry and some of this stuff that are overthought and over evaluated and over complexified, if that's even a word. But
sure.
This is not one of them.
Okay.
Specifically for a startup or a acquisition that requires external growth. This is not a subject that you can really do DIY, and go after it. So
awesome. Okay, cool. And we're going to have a few more episodes on this in this season. And then later on when we do startups, I think we'll hit it again even harder and more in depth.
Awesome.
With acquisition, there's demographics, which is one thing, but then there's also the location of the practice. And I've talked with docs who are stuck in like a medical complex in the back, up the stairs, and no handicap access, and there's 5 other dentists in the same complex, versus the guys who are on the corner of, Macy's, the grocery store, or Myers, or whatever your regional grocery store, HEB, and there's families and people going past your store every single day. You can see it from a stoplight. How much do you factor in location versus demographics? And are those intertwined, or are those kind of separate factors?
They're pretty heavily related, because the demographic has to know that you're there.
Yeah.
Even if you're in a perfect demographic, you have to be, they have to be aware of you. So the location is basically your advertising 24/7 if they can see you. So the big thing with location that you hear on Dental Town from George Vale screaming about all the time, and any practice management course that you take, is visualization. Location is all about being able to see the sign, practice, where you are. It's a billboard that you don't have to pay for. It's a direct mail that you don't have to send out. It's a website that they don't have to click on. If they see the practice, they're thinking about that as being the dental practice. So,
well, and they talk about in marketing that it takes, 7 exposures to a name or a brand or whatever before someone finally, makes the click or makes the call and pulls the trigger. So if you think about, if you're on that street corner and that person sees you every single day on their way to and from work, then, when something starts hurting or they're like, I really should go in and get a checkup, they're gonna think of that practice. And then if they see something online, if you've targeted your advertising on Facebook or done some direct mail, it all compounds. And I like it when people talk about leases as a form of advertising, and if you have to pay a little bit more to be in a better spot, that's not a bad thing. Would you agree with that?
I do, absolutely. And it's exactly what you said. It's just a constant impressions of to people of knowing where you are and what you are. And it's not a coincidence that my biggest of the 6 practices is, or excuse me, our biggest practice of the 6 is the one that has the best visibility, that's right across from a Walmart, that has a residential area behind it, that's on a major 4-lane highway that's traveled by many cars. It's not a gigantic surprise that practice gets more new patients than one that we would have to, kind of show where it is a little bit more. So location is about visibility. It's about, can they see you from the road? How many people are on that road? What that road besides the dental office has on it. The main thing is visibility, and then secondly is how many people will it be visible to. So
this week I got my Form 2 in the mail, and I'm stoked. This is awesome. The Form 2 is an SLA printer. This is significant because the previous generation of 3D printers was like a hot glue gun that would melt plastic and lay them layer by layer. And for a long time, these were not accurate enough for use in dentistry. Formlabs came along and took an industrial concept of laser curing resin. So it's like a laser plus a vat of flowable composite, and layer by layer, it cures each layer. And you can get much higher resolution. This has been around for a long, long time in the industrial 3D printing realm. And actually, there's a documentary on Netflix called Print the Legend about the founding of Formlabs and the next generation of this revolution that we're going through with 3D printing. I loved it because it showed the real struggles and choices that entrepreneurs have to make, and much like us in a dental practice. So check it out, Print the Legend on Netflix.
Formlabs basically started in the basement of the house that Dave and I were living in.
If you're a leader, every day there is something new that comes up and smacks you in the face.
Welcome to the age of the printed magazine. We're information anarchists. There should be one law. If the police can have it, if the military can have it, then you can have it.
We were all inventing what was going to come next.
A great partner will turn into a horrible enemy. A company you've never heard of before will come out with something that changes the game.
Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything.
For me, that's exactly what the Form 2 is. To check it out, go to formlabs.com/shared practices and request a sample surgical guide.
Visible too.
So, we started off talking about kind of this range of values that you would be willing to pay for a practice. So you can't directly measure and correlate demographics and location. In my mind, they're kind of unknowns. You think, you're like, okay, this should be a good demographic and this should hold stable. You can't control if populations shift over time or if other dentists open up their office right near you. And same thing with your location. You think it's going to be a good location until, the commercial complex next to you goes vacant because, someone stopped paying their lease and all this, goes on. So there's always risk and there's always variation. But how would you factor these into the evaluation? Would they just kind of expand that range that you'd be willing to pay a little bit upwards?
Yeah, pretty massively. I think those are probably positive demographics and a positive location are pretty near the top, if not the top of the evaluating factors.
Okay.
Because it can swing a bad practice. It can make a good practice that was just really based on the reputation of the previous dentist a bad practice if you have a lot of attrition and then you can't externally grow that practice back. So it's such a important part that I would say it's a major evaluating practice or a factor that can let you pay way more for a practice than a poor demographic would.
Okay, cool. So what else? I can't remember. Was there anything else that we talked about in the pre-show that we wanted to dive into before we got into the meat of actually coming up with values and evaluation range?
Yeah, the second thing was, and it's going to be important because the evaluating range is based on, I don't think we talked about the different terminologies for profitability of
That's
a
right.
practice.
That's right. Okay.
So the first and foremost thing that you need to understand is you have the collection number, and then you have your overhead. And if you're the solo doc and you're the only person working in that practice, and you got $1 million practice and you got 50% overhead, then you got $500,000 of expenses, your profit, the profit that you make as being a dentist, is $500,000.
Okay. So you're lumping doctor production and owner profit together for that.
If you're a solo doc working, on his own.
Okay. Sure.
Your profitability is the profit is defined as those two things.
Okay.
The part that he makes for being a doctor plus the part that he makes for owning a business.
Okay.
Makes up a term that I call profit. I've heard different terms for it, but for simplicity, profit, gross income is how I like to describe that.
Okay. So that's the most basic form of profit. How else could we think about that?
And just a kind of a definition of that amount after paying normalized overhead for the profit.
Okay. And we talked about normalization last time, and this idea that you can sneak some of that profit into various aspects of your practice, and then maybe you're paying less taxes on those. So that's why it's so important that you bring someone on to normalize this data after you've had your first look at it and decided, you know what, this is worth investigating. I'm going to bring on a CPA or a transition expert who can normalize this data for me. So now you've got the normalized data, you have that profit, what'd you call it, gross income?
Gross income or profit. I determine profit for simplicity.
Okay.
And it is prior to paying anything else other than normalized overhead expenses.
Okay.
The next layer of profitability is a term EBITDA, which is an acronym for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So those letters make up the term EBITDA.
EBITDA. And so if people's eyes just glazed over because they, like now that we're going into the accounting world, what does that mean in common, I don't care about taxes and all these other things? And how can I think about that if I'm not deep into this world of taxes and accounting?
Yeah, so what that term signifies is basically the business profit. It is the profit, which we just discussed, minus a fair compensation to pay the doctor. So what he makes for being a doctor in that practice, taken out of the profit of the practice, leaves you with the EBITDA. Profit minus fair doctor compensation.
Okay. So go ahead.
I was going to say, basically, it's a term that's used in other industries. For our purposes, it means that. But it's a term that just means what is the profitability of a business before you account for accounting strategies or loans and those type of things that would go into decreased earnings. How profitable is that practice? And that's what EBITDA describes.
Okay. And so another reason to look at this and another way to think about it is if you had an associate who, say that you got sick and you needed to bring someone into your practice and they were going to do your production while you were sick, you would pay them a percentage, and let's say 30%. We're talking about the same $1 million practice. We had $500,000 going to overhead, $500,000 of profit. Now we pay that associate 30% of that million, give them $300,000, and we take home $200,000. So that owner profit, quote unquote, the $200,000, that would be EBITDA. Is that the right way to think about it?
It's a little bit more complex, only because some of that $1 million is actually hygiene money that you wouldn't pay a percentage of. Okay. So a kind of an easy way to think about it is on a typical dental practice, it's 75% doctor, 25% hygiene. You're going to pay about a doctor about 25% of the total revenue to run that practice.
Interesting.
So on our $1 billion practice, they would have about, if it had 50% overhead, you'd have $500,000 of profit left. You would pay the doctor about $250,000, then you would have about $250,000 left of EBITDA, which is a 25% EBITDA percentage, which is a really strong EBITDA percentage for a general dental practice.
So that would be like phenomenal. That would be great, because then you could have an associate working there, making good money, and you're making good money, and you technically, other than maybe running the practice and doing the behind the scenes stuff, you're not actually doing any dentistry.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a term that describes the health, basically, of the business. So the reason in our example, the EBITDA percentage is so high is because, the overhead is only 50%. So that's a well-ran dental practice that's got a 25% hygiene base. So it's got $250,000 of hygiene, passive-ish production coming in. So it's just a healthy business. So it's able to spit off healthy business profits. So to me, as an absentee owner, EBITDA is what I make. To a new grad who's going to buy their first dental practice, they make the profit because they're going to get what they do as being a doctor plus what they get for running the business. I just get what I make for running the business. So for a lot, I get kind of made fun of a little bit on Dental Town for mentioning this term too much, but it's really not overly important for a solo doc, only doc in the office business owner.
Okay.
That it's not really necessary to know your EBITDA very much unless you just want to know how healthy your practice is from a your two hands production level.
But people give you a hard time because they're like, well, I take home everything after paying the overhead. So I take home the profit. Why do you need to break it down into my production versus this other extra money that's left over? It's all the same. I'm the business owner. What's the big deal?
Yeah, exactly. It's the next level because a lot of people, the majority of those guys are on-site owners, which we promote. So you wouldn't necessarily need to know the EBITDA, and it's just an extra step to them. And it kind of is, unless you're talking about multiple locations, bringing on an associate or paying, you just want to know the health of your business. But it is the next step in profitability.
Okay. And the other thing is, as a solo doc working at your own office, it would be good to know, because if you have like zero EBITDA, that maybe that's a red flag of, oh, hey, crap, I'm not really running this business as a business. I'm just kind of using this as an associateship. And I could be doing the same production at a different office that's being run by another doc without all this extra stress and work of being an owner. I'm not getting paid for being the owner here.
Exactly.
And then on the flip side, if you're doing really well, now okay, it's got maybe just an indicator of health, like you said, for docs to look at.
Yeah, if your EBITDA is zero, that means you're basically everything that you're taking home, you're earning with your two hands. It's a negative. It's a red flag for your hygiene, which happens in almost every old practice. They're using hygiene as a loss leader just to fuel the restorative work. So they're actually losing money on hygiene at times, or they have overhead issues that are cutting into the business profits with either overstaffed or just no supply control at all. So it's just a health metric. If you're an on-site owner, if you're an absentee owner, obviously to me, that's the only thing that matters in a practice that I'm evaluating is what is the EBITDA, how much money am I going to make off of it?
Right. Okay. Well, so we've been playing with some really nice round, even numbers for example's sake, but I also don't want to give our listeners unrealistic expectation that they're going to stumble across this 50% overhead, 25% EBITDA practice. That would be great if we could just find those laying on the ground. What would be realistic numbers of the average practice that's going to come across someone's search for an acquisition?
As bad as it pains me to even say it, I would say 10% EBITDA is going to be pretty good if you see that. I mean, it's not pretty good, but that's going to be pretty common.
Okay.
Some of the bigger DSOs that I've talked to for their general dental practices, they shoot for 18 to 22%.
Okay.
EBITDA. Our Southern Dental Group locations are about 26% just because we're exclusively general dental practices. We have a small admin layer and we're very involved so that we can really, really control that. So we're definitely way above average having this many we run somewhere between 26 and 28. We have practices over 30 and some below 20 or below 25, but the average is 26 to 28.
Well, and that's where you and Will are doing the work. Like that's where your work exists, it seems like, is to manage and create that EBITDA across those practices. And so if you don't have someone intimately involved and watching and optimizing the EBITDA of a practice because they're too busy doing the clinical dentistry, it's hard to expect that number to be that high.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to think of it, the national average or whatever overhead that constantly gets reported is somewhere around 65%. There's different sources that quote it. Some say up over 70 and some say around 60, but it's somewhere around 65. And if you go back to our example of you're going to pay a doctor with payroll taxes and everything all in about 25% if the practice is a 3-to-1 hygiene to doctor ratio, then that right there, 65 plus 25 is 90. You're left with about 10% EBITDA, which is, I would say, is going to be fairly common for guys and girls that are looking at their first practice, and when they're evaluating, if they're pulling that number, it's going to be about 10%, 10 to 15.
Okay. So what I want to say is that you're not going to find these diamond in the rough that are super profitable in both of these senses very often. But what you can find is a practice who's at these levels, but has some of these potential upside with demographics, upside with location, upside with potential hygiene because the hygiene ratio is good. So those are the practices that you're trying to find and then making offers on and negotiating over. Is there anything else that, like, would you hold out for a more profitable practice, or would you look for one of these average profitable practices with potential upside?
Last episode we talked about valuations being both a formula and an art. The formula being based on the way the practice is then, and then the art part is trying to figure out what that practice is worth for you. Okay. So again, the EBITDA percentage is just a piece of the pie. If it's low because the fixed expenses are not very high or really high, then that's a bad practice to try to mess with. Okay. But if the EBITDA is really low because they're spending 20% on supplies or something that's an easy fix, and they got a really big hygiene base, but they just refer everything out, then you see how that's a little different situation than the one that had high fixed expenses and that was really maximizing the practice and still had a low EBITDA percentage. So I wouldn't say that you hold out based on just that metric alone. It's just another way. It's just another piece of the puzzle, part of the art form that goes into describing what you're going to get out of that practice and what that practice could become in the future for that specific buyer. Okay. Is there any other profit terminology that we should look at before we dive into the formula side of valuation? Yeah, just two real quick. The next one is so I want you to think of this as a stepwise progression. Profit is is just after you pay overhead, before you pay a doctor or any kind of accounting. Then you get EBITDA after you pay the doctor. The third level is gross cash flow, which is the amount of money left after paying your overhead, your doctors, and any loan payments you have. So if you had $100,000 a year in loan payments on your $1 million practice, now you have 50% overhead, you're down to $500. You have to pay an associate $250 to work there. You're down to $250, which is your 25% EBITDA. Now you got $100,000 of loan payments. Your actual gross cash flow is $150,000. That's how much spendable money you have before you pay taxes. So EBITDA, the difference between EBITDA and gross cash flow is mainly loan payments. Is that correct? Yeah, it's anything that would take cash from you, but that's usually just loan payments that are not included in the other two measures. And just to clarify, some of the loan payments are any of them pre-tax, or are they all post-tax, or some of them are pre-tax, some of them are post-tax, and that's just a little more complex? That's kind of the next level. The third level is net cash flow. Okay. So if that level is gross cash flow, the net cash flow is the amount left after paying the overhead, all the doctors. So now you're to EBITDA, all the loan payments. So now you're down to gross cash flow. And then finally the taxes. So now you're down to net cash flow. This is the actual money that you can take home and give to your husband or wife and y'all go on a trip with. That is net cash flow. And to answer your question,
one of the fastest ways to increase case acceptance in your office is through digital photography. However, it doesn't matter if you buy a fancy DSLR if you don't actually use your camera. There's a course on speareducation.com called 6 Images That Will Improve Case Acceptance, given by Dr. Steve Ratcliffe.
These are the 6 images that we're talking about. A natural smile, an image with the lips retracted and the teeth slightly apart, occlusal shots of both the maxillary and mandibular arches, and buccal images with the teeth slightly apart. The reason we choose these 6 images is that in 6 simple pictures, you can show your patients every surface of every tooth in the mouth, their relationship to one another, and also look at the health of the gum tissue and surrounding structures. The equipment is really very basic, and one of the things...
The great part about this course is that not only does Dr. Ratcliffe go through what the photos are, the equipment you need, how to take them, but you can also have your staff watch this video and then take these for you. Now, maybe you're not going to trust every single team member to take all these photos, but having 1 or 2 key individuals that can take these photos for you can alleviate that feeling of, ugh, I do not want to take another set of photos right now. To get access to this course on digital photography and hundreds of others, go to speareducation.com and request a guest pass. If you mention the Shared Practices podcast, that'll actually get you a 30-day trial, and then you can use the promo code LOW200, LOW200, for $200 off your annual membership.
Net cash flow. And to answer the reason it answers your question is because sometimes early in the buying when you first buy a practice for the first year or two, gross and net cash flow may be the same because you can depreciate and amortize and write off all the business interest of your practice loan.
Okay.
But now as you go on, you can't, you run out. This is a very complex topic for taxes, but you run out of being able to depreciate some of the equipment before you actually pay the note off. So you're actually paying taxes on more than you're actually bringing home.
Well, and actually that makes total sense. And in episode 2 of season 2, that's actually coming out in 2 days from right now when we're recording, Reese Harper talked about this idea of when you first buy the practice, you have all those write-offs. And so you're not paying sometimes any taxes at first, and your consumption and loans that you get, commercial loans and home loans and car loans, can soon fill up that gross cash flow equals net cash flow when you're not paying any taxes at first. And then those tax breaks kind of slope off over the next 4 years or so. And suddenly you were doing super well at first. Now you're feeling strapped, even though you're making a ton of money. You're also paying a ton of taxes and you have all these obligations. So the behavioral side of things, like for me, buying a dental practice and like realizing at first, like, wow, I'm not paying anything in taxes is both awesome and also kind of scary behaviorally if you start getting used to all that money coming in and spending it just as quick as it comes in.
Yeah, which is why I think it's important to understand all 3 or all 4 levels of our profitability table here, because that the gross and the net cash flow are going to change over time because of the way you depreciate goodwill and the way you amortize and depreciate equipment and stuff like that. You can always write off the business interest, but as anybody who's ever bought a house or a car knows, the majority of the interest you pay on the front end. So as you go longer in the note, it's more principal and less interest. So now you're writing off less interest and you're out of your depreciation and your amortization on the rest of the loan. So more of that principal now is taxable.
Okay.
So again, just real quickly, because I know we got to get into acquisitions, but you got the profit, which is after you pay overhead, before you pay a doctor.
Let me stop you. Let me try and summarize it back to you, because I'm just the same. I have to like teach something before I like fully get it and understand. So correct me if I'm wrong here. I'll break it down.
Gotcha.
So profit is the money that is left over after you've paid all your fixed and variable expenses. So pay your staff, pay all your overhead, your bills, your lights, everything, the supplies. Now you've got this pool of money left over, quote unquote, for the doctor. if you're the solo doc at a practice. Then you pay yourself or pay an associate, if someone else works for you, a fair compensation, and you're left with EBITDA as the owner profit, and the doctor compensation is its own separate pile. And then if you take EBITDA and subtract any loans, practice loans, equipment loans, any of that, now you're left with gross profit. Did I say that right? Gross profit? Gross
cash flow is what I say.
Gross cash flow. And then once you finally subtract the taxes, then you have net cash flow, which is how much money you're actually going to take home. And it's important to calculate those last two, because even though you may calculate the profitability of the practice, if you forget, oh yeah, I have a practice loan that I have to pay, and you got to account for taxes and how those are going to change over time, those last two numbers, even though it might seem like, oh, why do I have to figure all this out, are important for, can I actually live on the money I'm going to make from this practice I'm going to buy?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, perfect. I think the only caveat I would put in there is, if you are the solo doc, you're the only practicing doctor there, then the stepwise progression where you ended with net cash flow is actually the net cash flow of just the business. So you would go back and add in your fair doctor compensation that you subtracted out on your EBITDA,
right? Because
you technically make that as well.
Okay.
If you're a solo doctor. So this is a stepwise progression to describe the business profit.
So you can kind of merge step 1 and 2 if you're the solo doc.
Exactly. Those two things are interchangeable depending on what you are in the practice.
Okay. Okay, cool. So now we have all of this information. We've evaluated it. We've put it into these different terms. Let's do some examples of how do we come up with a value or a value range? What is like if you were to give me the simplest formula that I held a gun to you and said in 10 seconds, 15 seconds, how do I tell what the value of a practice is? What's the easiest, even if it's inaccurate, what's the easiest way to spit out a valuation?
Yeah, I'm not going to say the one that everybody wants me to say. It's the percentage of collections. I'm not doing it because I hate it.
Okay, good.
But if I had to describe it, it's very simple formula, actually. It's just a multiple of either the profit or the EBITDA, depending on whether you're going to be the doctor working it or whether you're going to be an absentee owner.
Okay.
So
it's not a percentage of the collections. Well, so there's percentage of collections, but then is there also a multiple of the profit? Are those two different valuation methods?
Yes, absolutely. Percentage of collections is a huge pet peeve of mine. It's unfortunately banks kind of loan up to that as a way to evaluate.
Well, I want to get you a little bit pissed off because I want to hear how you really feel about this and why you think that's such a dumb way to value a practice, because I think it's valuable for people to understand your thinking and why it frustrates you.
Yeah, and you're going to hear it a lot if you're reading or talking to bankers or anything, guys. Is what you're going to hear is the practice is worth 2/3, 66% or whatever of the previous year's collections.
Okay.
Right away, you should be upset because it doesn't make any sense, because it doesn't account for all the things that we've been talking about in terms of expenses. You're literally looking at half the picture, which is just the revenue of the practice, and it's irregardless of what's actually happening in the practice to arrive at that X amount of revenue.
Okay.
So if you're doing it that way and you got $1 million practice, you got $2 million practices, and one of them have 80% overhead and the other one has 50% overhead, even though one of them's spitting off $500,000 of cash and the other one's spitting off $200,000 of cash, you're saying that they're both worth $666,000.
Makes no sense.
Which is just insane. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. What if one of them has a lease that's $20,000 a month?
Right.
Both practices don't have the same value. The value of a practice is a multiple of its profitability. I don't want to say you'll hear another mistake that you'll hear is they'll say of the cash flow. Cash flow is important. Cash flow. Cash flow is after you pay the debt. So we're talking profitability here.
Okay.
It's a percentage of how profitable the practice is.
After debts.
Or not a percentage, excuse me. It's a multiple of. So the multiple is arrived at based on mainly the range of multiples is based on kind of a comparable sales almost. Like if homes are selling for X amount of square foot or whatever in your region, then that's kind of what the multiple is.
Okay, so let me try like a round example and see if I can explain what I think it is, and you'll probably tell me I'm wrong. So if you took that $1 million practice and we had 50% overhead, and we're the solo doc, so we're taking both the EBITDA and the doctor production as one. We're just going to call that profit overall, and we have $100,000 loan that we're paying each year on the practice. Or it's not, the loan isn't $100,000, but that's, say that, I don't even know what a reasonable practice payment per year would end up being. So say that it's 50,000. So then our take home after paying the loan without paying taxes would be 450. Is that the multiple, is that the number they're looking at, or are they looking at something else? Do I need to go one step further down and take off taxes?
No, you went one way, actually. It's even more simplistic than that. It's prior to the loan payments.
Prior to the loan payments. Okay. Cash flow prior to loan payments.
Yeah. So that's why I said about the cash flow. I don't really like saying it's a multiple of the cash flow, because the cash flow is actually what, cash that you can spend that's flowing into practice. So I think of it as a multiple of the profit. So a way to think of this is,
so we're talking about that 500,000, not the 450, not anything less.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. It's a multiple of that. The multiple range, it's variable based on the region, but in a vacuum, you can kind of pay 1.3 to 1.9 times the profit of the practice as a purchase price.
Okay, so like 500,000 times 1.3 would be like 650 up to like 900. No, I'm doing my math wrong. I can't think of that 1.9.
950.
950. Okay. So a practice that brings home 500,000 a year before taxes or loans could demand 650 to 950 depending on the region, and it'd be like an average, like, oh, well, all of these practices sold at this multiple of their profit, so that's the number that we're going to use as our baseline profitability multiplier. Is that how that works?
Not really. The range is based on the region. So that 1.3 to 1.9, say that's what the range of practices that are selling are in Arkansas.
Okay.
Now, say you go to Bay Area, California, and they're selling for 1.5 to 2.5 times
okay.
profit. So the range is kind of region specific. But I really think that people should stay in this 1.3 to 1.9 range.
Okay.
When they're trying to find a fair value range, because once it gets outside of that range, then you need to start thinking, okay, I'm giving up profitability, or I'm having to evaluate this practice much higher because of the region it's in alone.
Okay.
So, and you'll see this in an example later. But what you should see based on that is how big a range you can pay for a practice.
That's a huge range.
It's $350,000 of, it's over a third of the total value on the high end.
Right.
So what does that tell you? So there's the science, or the formula part of the evaluation. It's very easy to find a fair value range for a practice based on its profitability. The art part of it, and the part that's so buyer specific, is finding out where in that range you can pay for that practice. And then if you're somewhere, if what you can pay for that, if your more specific range is around where the purchase price is, then that's a practice that you should buy.
Okay.
If it's outside that range, then you have to start explaining why and whether you're willing to accept those complications, that giving up that profit that you're going to be giving up in order to have that particular practice.
So personally, what would be the factors that for me change that practice that maybe for another doctor, for them, it wouldn't shift that range up or down?
Basically your skill set, what procedures you can add. If you're talking about on just an individual standpoint, what factors go into further narrowing down that range just for anybody are the things that we talked about last episode: the demographics, the fixed overhead percentage, the size of the patient base, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
When you start getting buyer specific, is things like what procedures can you add to the practice? What procedures are you going to lose that the seller does that you don't do? Just how badly do you want to live there? And this is not a real scientific thing.
We're really deep into the art right here. How bad do you want this practice?
Exactly. Or what does it mean to you? If is your family from there and you have to live there, then that practice suddenly just got a higher valuation from you than it would for me because of that. And you shouldn't think of it that way.
Don't tell the seller that, but in your mind, I mean, realistically, that's what you have to be willing to pay.
Yeah. So those kind of things matter on those valuating factors. Where in that fair range can you pay for the practice based on, one, what do you add, how bad you want the practice, what are you willing to give up to get in it, and what are the factors or what are the practice's valuating factors that make it more likely to get sold at that high price. So say our $1 million practice, say it has 50% overhead and say it has 40% hygiene.
Okay.
So that's one of our evaluating factors. And that's a really, really good hygiene.
That'd be great.
Yeah. So suddenly you can start thinking, I can pay a bigger multiple for that practice because that's telling me things like the patient base is bigger. Maybe I can add procedures and get more revenue off the doctor side, or maybe he's underdiagnosing. Maybe he's a referodontist, or just things like that. So that makes you think, I can pay on the upper end of this range.
Right.
This practice is more valuable.
He's doing a lot of patchwork and just holding patients over and sending things off. You can really add a lot of value.
Yeah. So, but now say your $1 million practice has 10% hygiene, and he's doing full mouth rehabs, and he's doing molar endo that you don't do, and he's getting referrals because he's the biggest cosmetic dentist in the state.
Sure.
But he doesn't have a big recall base. So now that practice, I can't pay for that. I can't pay that 1.9x, that $950,000, because I can't replicate what he's doing.
Right. Are you able to negotiate with these factors? It seems like this is like the decision point for you. You then make an offer with what you'd be willing to pay and see if they're willing to move. But I mean, obviously explaining to them might not have any effect. That I can't replicate this production. Well, they're like, well, tough luck. This is what the production is. How does that go down?
I don't like negotiating on purchase prices because I feel like it kind of sours the deal.
The goodwill.
It's going to leave everybody with a bad taste in their mouth. The practice either fits you or it doesn't.
Okay.
Our industry, our business has such huge margins that overpaying by $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, depending on how big the practice is not going to make or break whether that's a good practice to buy. So I don't like really going back and saying the purchase price was $700,000 and then you presenting $650,000 for it. That there's just not. It's not really.
It's not worth that extra $50,000. That's going to be spread out over the life of the practice, anyways. And so, not that $50,000 isn't a big deal, but when you look at the potential patients that were lost if that old doc doesn't recommend you, or just how things can go south kind of quickly in these negotiations if you keep going back and forth.
Exactly. Now, say where I do think it's okay to present the different purchase price is, say in our $1 million practice, they have it listed at $800,000, but they were doing some ortho plus full mouth rehabs that you're not going to be able from referrals. So to me, that percentage of the practice is a specialty practice that you can't replicate. So when you're evaluating it, you evaluate it at $600,000 for you.
Okay.
So now you're way off, but you maybe go to the seller and say, here's a letter of intent for your practice. I can pay $600,000 for it, and you can explain why you can't. And then it's either kind of is this something that you're willing to pursue, seller, because of my limitations as a buyer? And either they are or aren't. If they're not, no, the practice is worth this, then they're looking for a different type of buyer than you are. But if they do see that, and it's been on the market a long time, then you may get it closer to your purchase price.
So if you're gonna do that, it sounds like you kind of want to do it in a air of humility, of saying, I like this practice, I like everything you're doing here. I just know that I can't do this production because I'm going to have to refer this out. Would you be willing to bring down that price? And knowing that might be a shot in the dark, and the answer might be no pretty quickly. Yeah,
exactly. That's how we approach it. And even if it's not, it doesn't necessarily have to be in, an air of humility, or because it may not be based on just the profit.
Okay.
It may not even be based on just the procedure base. Say the rent's going to be a lot higher for you, or say you're in California and you can't get in network with Delta Premier anymore, or things that are limiting factors for a new buyer that are maybe not even you specific. You just say, hey, we evaluated your practice, me and my advisors, and we arrive at a price of closer to X. Are you willing to pursue a sale at closer to this price? Here's the reasons why.
Okay.
That kind of negotiation I think is okay, because you're trying to do what's best for you. But what I don't like to see is when it's like you're nickel and diming here at the end over $30,000 or $40,000, and you're potentially going to lose a practice that was worth it for you over that inconsequential amount of money over the long term. So
okay.
Negotiation is bad in that way. Negotiation is good if you're way apart and you're just trying to see if the seller is desperate enough to sell or ready enough to sell at a price that's more reasonable for you as a buyer. I hope that makes sense.
No, absolutely. Okay, so the one last question I had, and I apologize, this is like 2 steps back. Is there a multiple of EBITDA that people use for valuation, or do they really just use multiple of overall collections, which is bad, versus multiple of profit, which is better?
Yeah, if you're an absentee owner, or you're looking for your second, third, fourth location that you're not going to be working at, or even if you are going to be working at it a little bit, you transition to, instead of a multiple range based on the profit, it's a multiple range of EBITDA.
Okay.
What our industry is seeing right now is those are going down for individual seller, or for doctor to doctor sales.
Okay.
But right now, last reports I've heard are somewhere between 2.5 and 4.5 to 5 times EBITDA. So 2.5 to 5, I think, was the range I would give.
So that's solo doc selling to solo doc, 2.5 to 5, you said?
Yeah, and not necessarily just solo doc, but kind of a smallish group, like someone like me to a solo seller.
Okay.
We would expect to be somewhere in that range.
But that would be like, I've heard of brokers or practice valuations where they calculate everything out and then they like weight these different values, so they say, okay, we're going to do the percentage of collections and we're going to multiply that by 0.5. And then we're going to do multiple of profit. And then we're going to multiply that by 0.25. And then we're going to do a multiple of EBITDA. And then we're going to multiply that by 0.25. So now you have this weighted average of the 3, and you put all that together, and that's how they arrive at their price. Is that common? Is that kind of how people get to this number in the strictly math sense of it all?
Yeah, it's very common, and it's the way that brokers, in a way, justify their fees in a way that they can they go through and try to arrive at a preset purchase price. So what you'll see in these pro formas is you'll see stuff like this practice is worth $666,000 and 35 cents.
Right.
I mean, it's an over exaggeration, but you'll see that super exact purchase price, which doesn't, I mean, that there's no such thing as that exact of a purchase price in our industry. So, but what they do is they go through all those complex and sometimes just stupid formulas and multiples and weighted averages of these different evaluation methods to arrive at a purchase price. And usually what happens is the broker goes to the seller and says, "Hey seller, how much you want to sell your practice for?" And they say, "Oh, I don't know, 65% of collections is what everybody says." And then the broker goes through on his pro forma that I told you guys to get, and they finagle the numbers and they weight those averages, different evaluation methods until they arrive at prices somewhere around there.
Okay.
So that definitely happens. It's not the way I want buyers to think of it when they're buying a practice. I want you to think of arriving at a range based on the profitability of the practice, and then within that range, judging the evaluating factors of the practices that we talked about last time, judging what it means to you as a buyer, and then if your purchase price in that range is somewhere near the purchase price of the practice, then you buy the practice.
Sure.
If it's not, and if it's way off, then you present to the seller, "Hey, I'm more here based on my review of the practice. I'd be glad to explain why. Is it something that you're willing to pursue at around this rate?" And if it is, then you continue on with the due diligence and the discussions. And if it's not, then you walk away and look for your next opportunity. I don't want them to get super bogged down in these. Well, the projected cash flow is worth 70% of the total value, and the percentage of collections is worth 5%, and how many 70-year-old ladies came in the practice is worth 2%. I mean, it's insane and unnecessary, and it's not the way a buyer should go about evaluating a practice opportunity.
Okay, so if we backpedal all the way to the beginning, and now we say we're going to get the raw pro forma from a broker, and you have all these numbers, you could run a rough calculation at the beginning and say, given let's assume the numbers they gave me are right and not massaged, is this in a range that is worth investigating? So you can kind of use these formulas, the 60%, 66% of collections, that's not a great one, but that 1.3 to 1.9 of profit is maybe a decent range to look at right up front as a rough rule of thumb. And the EBITDA, maybe you don't need to use that, and then from there, kind of dive in a little deeper and say, okay, let's get some real numbers. So then you get the real data back from them as much as you can. And maybe you have a spreadsheet and you kind of plug it into that spreadsheet and you say, okay, now what are the numbers telling me based on the extra data that they've given me? And then if it still looks good, then you bring on someone to normalize their numbers and really get like a professional grade, true set of values and numbers that you can plug into these formulas and match up with what you could do and make an offer. Is that excessive, or is that kind of a good flow to go through all of this?
I like that flow. I think my big thing there would be when you bring on somebody, and that's going to be kind of buyer specific. It's going to be confidence specific. It's going to be basically practice specific in a way.
So that maybe that would be the heavy DIY version of it.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty heavy version to get it that far in there. But I do want them to get a little bit in there, because what I don't like to see is you get these that are obviously bad practices, and then you go pay a CPA and attorney $5,000 and $9,000 a piece, and then to go evaluate this practice with you, and it's just shit. I mean, so I don't like that strategy, but I also don't want you to get so emotionally invested in this practice and then bring somebody on and them have to tell you that it's shit, and
right.
Then it sours that relationship, and you're maybe push forward with it against your advisors.
Okay.
So there's a sweet spot in there about when you bring people on. Part of what what our company does is offer services that are specific for the buyer at whichever stage they're at.
Sure.
So we even go back to the very beginning. If you gather that initial data for us that we talked about last time, with the practice pro forma and the production reports, the income statement from the previous year and tax returns, that kind of stuff, then we'll do a real quick and dirty range to see if that practice is even worth pursuing in a cheap manner versus, a real deep due diligence that may not be necessary at all.
Well, and I feel like this is built in or baked into like how you think and how you see things. It's almost like you've done this enough and talked about it and thought about it and debated and discussed and gotten heated arguments and taught others that is probably pretty quick for you to do that. Like how long would that take you if you had the right set of data? How long would it take you to do something like that?
To get just the purchase range?
Yeah, just get a rough range.
Yeah, 2 hours.
Okay.
If that long. I mean, it's
assuming you honestly had good data. You'd probably have to track some more data down and make sure you had all the right stuff. But if
if there's big caveats, like if depending on how specific on the range they want me to get.
Sure.
But on the low end of say, just for an example purposes, for the services we offer, for the low end of that range, I mean, it's just taking a couple hours to if that long, to get a range that practice should be sold in.
Well, and this is awesome that you offer this and that you've explained so well the whole process, because one of our other episodes that I brought up, my buddy hired someone thinking that they were going to do some level of this valuation. I think he thought they were going to dive in and normalize the data and come up with a valuation and then negotiate that for him. And that's kind of what he thought going into it. Okay, I'm going to pay this guy this much money and he's going to take care of all this for me. And in the end, he had to do all of that himself, including the negotiation and the valuation, and there was no normalization. And this was a partnership, and so he was buying into things. So it's maybe a little bit different than an acquisition straight up. But understanding what you need and exactly who can provide that service and being clear up front can save a lot of money and time and effort and frustration. So it's awesome that I can come to you and I can reach out and say, hey, Hunter, I just need a rough idea. I think this looks good. Am I right? Is this even worth looking at further? And then, okay, this is looking pretty good. Let's come up with a really specific number. You and me sit down with my specific situation and come up with an offer. To have kind of that broken down into different steps and have different kind of tiers of involvement that you can have with an individual, I think is a huge service. So I love that you guys are turning this into a business and an opportunity to help others with this. So thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think even what's also cool about it is if you do listen to enough of the podcast that, I and people, my mentors and people I learn from speak on and give information from, you may get good enough or feel comfortable enough to see these practices on that front end where it's a bad practice that you don't need to look further into, or it is good enough to start that first level of due diligence. So then you can skip that service necessarily, or feel comfortable in hiring the next team member because you're working towards your next goal. So that's part of the reason we structured our company like that, and the reason I give so much information and want to teach, the simplest part of our company and what I'm passionate about is teaching guys to buy good guys and girls to buy good practices. No. So I would love if people got good enough that they didn't need me or anybody else to look at the numbers, the initial numbers, to find out if that was a practice worth pursuing.
Anyone can develop that muscle, even if you're in dental school. I mean, you might be wasting some brokers' time, but I still think it's worth developing that muscle to reach out in an area and build a relationship with a broker who's got deals in your hometown or in your home state and say, hey, I really want to find a practice here. I just need to get a good gut feeling for what these practices are selling for. Can you send some information my way, or what are the details on this practice? I don't think brokers would turn people away.
No, they're not going to. You're going to sign I do it all the time. There's probably, if we've bought 6 practices, there's probably 50 that we've passed on, that we've done exactly what people should be doing when they're looking for their first practice, which is, looking in an area around where they want to live and work for practices, and just reaching out to brokers that have listings, reaching out to selling or older doctors who may be interested in selling, and getting that financial data and then reviewing it just basically however far you feel comfortable before bringing on a team member. It's, the first one is not always the best one just because you want it to be. So.
Right. No, absolutely. Well, we were going to get into some specifics. I think we're kind of out of time for this interview. So maybe we're going to have to do one more if you're down with it. It doesn't have to be quite as long as this one, but if maybe we looked at a couple practices, and can we do one more at some point?
Yeah, I think your last suggestion will be really cool. If anybody that has sent you one before, or that hears this podcast and wants to send in just some quick and dirty data on a practice to get a rough range or something like that, we can kind of work through it.
Cool.
Or if you want to kind of make one up or whatever.
I feel that having a real practice is going to be better. So maybe early in the season, because this probably isn't going to come out until later in the season. So I'm going to announce maybe even in this week that if someone wants to email you with practice information saying, hey, it would be cool to evaluate this on the practice. And maybe we might get a couple from listeners that are currently looking at things. And maybe we might even bump that episode up in the season, depending on where they're at, or at least we'll release it to them and they can listen to it. But I think that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I'll tell them to email me that they have one that they want looked at, and then there's just for the range. This is what we're talking about doing here is the formula part of the formula and art that goes into an evaluation. So just for the formula part, we'll tell them what information we need. We'll go over it on a podcast, and then kind of how I arrive at a range for that practice. Cool.
Awesome. This is going to be a ton of fun. Thank you so much again for coming on and sharing all of this hard-earned knowledge. And I know that you could hold back, but we really appreciate you just kind of laying it all out and helping our listeners with this. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I think this is stuff that I didn't necessarily invent. None of the things that we've talked about are new or anything like that, but hearing it in an organized form and just hearing it from people that you want to learn from and that I've learned from in this way, I think this is really good information for people that are looking to acquire practices. So we've covered some really good stuff. I'm excited about one more.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Hunter. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, man.
Okay, we have 100% proof that I am a huge nerd because I freaking loved that episode. I loved getting some really specific ranges. I think it was 66% of gross collections, and then 1.3 to 1.9 of gross income for a solo doc, and 2.5 to 5x EBITDA if you're looking at this as a multi-practice situation. Thanks to everyone who left reviews. We're at 50 reviews. 49 of them are 5-star, and then 1 4.5-star from Peds DDS because I took a break between seasons. That's okay. I'd love it if you guys left a review. Thank you for doing that for those who have. We're switching to releasing on Friday if my week was good, and Saturday if my week was rough. So today's Saturday. I had a little bit more rough week, but we made it. Talk to you guys soon on the Shared Practices Podcast Season 2.